This tape is for synthesists and other musicians who desire to know more about sound as it relates to music. In particular, it will teach you how synthesizers can be used to produce sonic imagery. In upcoming lessons on this tape and Volume 2, we will explore and explain virtually all aspects of analog and digital synthesis. Specifically, Secrets of Analog and Digital Synthesis will provide you with a set of meaningful tools and knowledge which can be applied to virtually any electronic musical instrument. In this first lesson, we will concentrate on how sounds are generated and perceived in the physical world. This is of vital importance to synthesists, since we must both imitate and innovate sound events. There is more to the art of sound design than tweaking parameters of a favorite preset or twisting knobs into some bold new configuration. A good synthesist has much in common with a good magician or a good impersonator. He must use sleight of hand and misdirection. He can imply conditions of musical and acoustical context and thus strengthen his sound imagery. If we could name and understand all of the various aspects of sound, how would it be useful to our real-world experience as musicians? The foundation of the sound designer's toolkit and bag of tricks is a solid understanding of the physical nature of sound and our perception of it. Listen to the sounds coming from your VCR right now. You are undoubtedly making associations with specific instruments and musical situations. You are also visualizing specific physical factors about the environments in which these sounds occur. In your mind's eye, you may be forming concrete or abstract images, but you are getting definite impressions about the reality in which these sounds were made. Yet what you are hearing has no basis in the real world. These sounds were, of course, generated electronically. And while this may not sound exactly like a Stratocaster feeding back, you probably thought of some related image before you thought of hands on a synthesizer keyboard. The point is, your mind will subconsciously order sonic information into imagery. This provides the sound designer a subtle yet effective manner to reinforce sonic illusion. Sound contains a set of components or parameters. We perceive changes in these parameters as clues that help us evaluate and identify what we hear. We will learn how to use synthesizers to control and simulate these clues. We will see how to break sound down into its basic parameters so that we may eventually synthesize sounds that exploit to our fullest advantage any of the clues we choose. Okay, where do we start? Where exactly does sound originate from? Or more to the point, what makes a sound musically useful? All sounds have three main parameters. We'll call them the big three: pitch, loudness, and timbre or tone color. What is the highest or lowest pitch you can hear? The loudest and softest sounds. Why does the same note played on two different instruments sound different? Let's look at two sources of sound, one acoustic and one electronic. Plucking a string on this viola or playing a key on the synthesizer will create sounds. The viola creates sounds directly. The synthesizer itself makes no sound. Its signals must be converted by a speaker into vibrations before it can be heard. Remember, synthesizers make no sounds by themselves until they are connected to a speaker. By watching and listening to these two sources of sound, we can observe the following. Something is moving when we hear a sound, and that motion is too fast for us to see clearly. As the sound fades away, the motion lessens. If I stop the motion, the sound stops. From these observations, we can make the following deductions. The generation of sound seems to be linked to motion, specifically vibration. Since sound has three main parameters, pitch, timbre, and loudness, it should be possible to find specific aspects of motion that relate directly to the big three. What exactly is sound, and how does it travel from its source to our ears? Sound is a form of energy. It is transmitted in waves. The motion of a vibrating object, like a tuning fork, disturbs the air around it. This disturbance moves outwards from the source in all directions. This traveling disturbance is similar to the waves formed on the surface of a still pond when you drop in a stone. Sound waves are actually minute changes in air pressure. They are virtually invisible, but we do have a device that will allow us to see sound waves. It is called an oscilloscope. We will be looking at the scope quite often in this course. Here are the basic rules for interpreting the images that it produces. When the oscilloscope is used to display sound waves, it is showing us changes in air pressure that occur over a period of time. Vertical distance on the scope represents measurements of air pressure. The center line represents normal air pressure. Distance above the center line represents higher than normal pressure. Distance below it represents lower than normal pressure. The horizontal distance from the left edge to the right edge represents a fixed amount of time. This time scale can be varied, and for sound measurements it's typically quite short, hundredths or thousandths of a second. Here is a typical scope image. This kind of repeating curve is called a wave. We can name the various parts of a wave, and in doing so we will have names for the various parameters of the vibrating string or loudspeaker's motion. Let's look at shape first. Not all repeating curves look just like this one, so the general term used for the shape of a wave is, simply enough, wave shape or waveform. Often a wave is referred to by the geometry of its wave shape. This wave is called a sine wave. Some other geometric waves are sawtooth and square waves. Geometric waves are quite common in synthesis, for reasons we'll soon find out, but not all waves are geometric. The highest and lowest parts of the wave are called peaks. The vertical distance between peaks is called amplitude. The horizontal distance from any given point on a wave to a point one full swing away is the wavelength. If the wavelength is expressed as a measure of time, it is called a period or cycle. Often, wavelength is expressed as how many periods or cycles occur within a fixed amount of time. This is called frequency. The more cycles you see on the scope, the higher the frequency. When measuring sound waves, frequency is often expressed in units called hertz, which stands for cycles per second. The abbreviation Hz is often used for hertz, and kHz for kilohertz, or thousands of cycles per second. Now we can equate the parameters of a wave with aspects of the viola string or loudspeaker's motion. Amplitude is the equivalent to the distance that the string or speaker moves back and forth when vibrating. Frequency is how quickly a vibrating object moves, and waveform is the overall pattern or shape of the vibrating motion. Remember the big three, pitch, timbre, and loudness? Do you think they could be related in any way to frequency, wave shape, and amplitude? You bet they are. This is a roll in Juno 106, and this is what it sounds like. Watch the waveform and see what happens when I change the volume of a note. Can you see that it is the wave's amplitude or overall height that is changing? Its shape and frequency remain constant. A sound wave, like all moving waves, is a form of energy. The amplitude of a wave is an indicator of how much power that wave contains at a given moment. The power represented by a sound wave's amplitude is usually referred to as intensity. It is the parameter of sound that we sense as loudness. In your manual is a detailed explanation of the relationships between intensity, loudness, and perception. Here is a summary of the important facts. There are definite limits to the softest and loudest sounds we can perceive. The softest sounds we can hear occur at the threshold of sensation. We'll call this ultra pianissimo. The loudest sounds occur at the threshold of feeling, which we'll call mega forte. The softest sound could be doubled in apparent loudness only 13 times before it reached the upper limit of loudness. Our ability to discern discrete changes in loudness is not very refined. If the loudness scale from ultra pianissimo to mega forte were split into 130 steps of equal volume changes, we would not be able to hear the individual change in loudness between any two adjacent steps. There are many ways to change pitch on a synthesizer. I'll use the bender, and again, watch the waveform. You can see that the number of cycles of the wave increases as the pitch is raised. The amplitude and shape remain constant. Our perception of pitch is related to frequency. As we have seen, frequency is a measurement of time, how long it takes for an event to repeat. The frequency of the Earth's rotation around its axis is once per day. The frequency of a minute hand traveling around the face of a clock is once per hour. The frequency of quarter notes in a Sousa march is 120 per minute. Rhythms are low frequencies. We hear them as a series of events. As frequency is increased, these events become closer and closer rhythmically, until at some point they begin to blur. There is, in fact, a kind of twilight zone where some people hear frequency as rhythm and others hear it as pitch. We are very fortunate to have with us today Mr. Frank Marilla, who has graciously taken time from his busy schedule as a star of a cult classic television show. Mr. Marilla has agreed to help us explain this nether region of pitch and rhythm. The heartbeat of an individual in good shape, like Frank here, is about 60 cycles per minute, or 1 per second. When we listen to this heartbeat, thank you, Frank, we hear its frequency as a steady rhythm. By connecting Frank to this device, we can safely raise his heartbeat. Remember, this is a carefully controlled experiment. Don't try this at home. The rhythm becomes faster and faster. You okay, Frank? As the frequency is increased further, we will begin to hear a pitch. I hear pitch right about here. That looks invigorating, Frank. This is a frequency of about 20 hertz, and we call this the lower threshold of pitch. As we continue to raise the frequency, hang in there, Frank. This is why you get the big bucks. We will eventually cease hearing pitch. If you have a dog, it's probably barking now. We call this point the upper threshold of pitch. When we were young, this could have been as high as about 20,000 cycles per second. But after years of rock and roll and industrial noise and MTV, this point begins to drop. Most of us still hear pitches up to around 16,000 times per second. Let's bring Frank back down to normal so he can relax. Thank you, Frank. You were great, babe. The total range of pitches from the highest to the lowest that we can hear is about 10 octaves. The octave is the most common pitch measurement used by musicians. It represents a net frequency change by a factor of 2. In other words, multiplying a frequency by 2 will cause a pitch to go up 1 octave, while dividing it by 2 will cause the pitch to go down 1 octave. The lower threshold of pitch, 20 Hertz, could be doubled only 10 times before it reached the upper threshold of pitch. This means that there is a definite limit to the highest and lowest pitches that we can hear. We are much more sensitive to changes in pitch than we are to changes in loudness. We can all easily hear changes in pitch of a semitone. That is the equivalent to 1/120th of the total pitch range. Most musicians can discriminate between two pitches that are only fractions of a semitone apart. Watch how the waveform changes as I change timbre. As you can see, changing the sound's timbre alters the wave shape. The frequency and amplitude remain constant. To a sound designer, timbre is probably the most important parameter of sound. In order to get a better look at the causes of timbre, we will look at sounds in a new way. This is a spectrum plot. We will be using them quite often in demonstrations that relate to timbre. Once again, the fine details are explained in your manual, but here are the basic points to keep in mind. A spectrum diagram shows a waveform not as a single shape, but as a collection of vibrations called partials. The frequency and amplitude of the various partials that make up a wave determine its overall shape and therefore timbre. Each vertical bar in a spectrum represents one partial. There is a natural order of frequencies that occur in nature called the harmonic series. Most musical sounds are made up of partials whose frequencies are a subset of this series. The lowest frequency in the series is called the fundamental, and it is the frequency we perceive as a sound's pitch. Since timbre is independent of pitch, it is not the actual frequencies that are important in a spectrum plot, but the intervals between the fundamental and other partials. For this reason, the intervals are expressed as ratios, simple whole numbers, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, times the fundamental's frequency. It is wave shape that allows us to recognize a friend's voice from among the voices in a crowd, or hear the difference between the same A flat played on two different instruments. A wave spectrum is like a fingerprint. No two wave shapes have exactly the same spectrum. A sawtooth spectrum looks like this. It has partials at all of the harmonic frequencies. A square wave spectrum contains partials at only the odd harmonic frequencies. A triangle wave spectrum is similar to a square wave's, only odd harmonic frequencies, but their individual amplitudes are much less than a square wave's. This is why a triangle sounds duller than a square wave. Wave shapes that are not geometric have partials that are not all at harmonic frequencies. Most musical sounds have timbres that change over the course of a note. If we could freeze the timbre of a brass note, we would see a spectrum like the one shown here. A clarinet has a spectrum very similar to this, and a metal bell might have a spectrum like this one. Remember, a spectrum plot is just another way of looking at wave shape. As we will see in upcoming lessons, it is a synthesizer's wave shaping abilities that make it such a capable imitator and innovator of sounds. Okay, let's review. What we perceive as sound are waves that originate at a vibrating source and are transmitted through the air. The three parameters of sound, pitch, timbre, and loudness, correspond to the three physical aspects of a wave's motion: frequency, wave shape, and amplitude. The sensation of pitch is directly related to a sound wave's frequency. There are definite limits to our perception of pitch. We can hear very minute changes in pitch. Frequencies below 20 Hertz we perceive as rhythms. The sensation of loudness is directly related to a wave's amplitude. There are also limits to the loudest and softest sounds we can perceive. We can hear loudness levels between the softest whisper and the roar of a jet engine, but our ability to discriminate between small changes in loudness is not very refined. The sensation of timbre is directly related to a wave's shape. Different wave shapes are made up of many individual vibrations that occur simultaneously. These vibrations are called partials. There is a common structure of partials called the harmonic series. There is no limit to timbre perception. Any sound wave with a repeating shape will be heard as having a specific tone color. We are extremely sensitive to changes in timbre. In fact, your ability to understand what I'm saying right now is almost wholly dependent on your ability to hear changes in timbre. The big three, pitch, timbre, and loudness, can be changed independently of each other. In this lesson, we begin an exploration of various synthesizers and their functions. We will start by comparing them with traditional instruments. We know from Lesson 1 what sound is, how it is transmitted through the air, and how we perceive it. We also know that sound has three essential elements, what we've been calling the big three: pitch, timbre, and loudness. All musical instruments, electronic or acoustic, must allow a performer to produce and control the big three. Any musical instrument can be broken down into three basic areas, each with its own function. Sources, modifiers, and controllers. We know we need something vibrating to provide our basic waveform. On the violin, the strings act as sources of vibration and are responsible for the basic waveforms and frequency of pitches coming from the instrument. Modifiers change a source's wave shape and amplitude, making them more musically useful. The body and bridge of a violin act as modifiers, giving the instrument its particular timbre and amplifying the source's vibration so that they can be heard. Modifiers themselves make no sound. They can only alter a source's waveform. The big three, pitch, timbre, and loudness, can be thought of as residing in these two areas, sources and modifiers. The most important functions of an instrument from a player's standpoint are those that allow precise changes in the big three. These are called controllers, and like modifiers, they make no sound. We hear their effect on sources and modifiers. It is important to realize that all synthesizers are the same, regardless of whether they are analog or digital, regardless of whether they are played from a keyboard, guitar, or drum pad. All synths must provide sources and modifiers that can be precisely controlled by the performer. Indeed, any musical instrument must provide these same features. What makes synthesizers unique is the variety of ways in which the big three can be controlled. In this lesson, we'll be looking at analog sources and modifiers. In the next lesson, we will see how they can be controlled to produce imitative sounds. Let's look at some sources first. The reed of a clarinet, the strings of a double bass, the mouthpiece of a tuba. All of these things act as sources in a musical instrument. Within synthesizers, there are electronic circuits called oscillators and noise generators that act as sources of audio waveforms, the electronic equivalent to acoustic vibrations. Every synthesizer must have at least one source. Many have more than one available. Let's look at the source section of a typical synthesizer. Before we begin, here are some things to keep in mind whenever you are checking out any function on any synthesizer. Whenever you are investigating a synthesizer function, here are some general things to look out for. First, what, if any, selectable features does the function have? These are usually associated with switches. Next, check out any variable parameters. These are usually associated with sliders, knobs, or number ranges, and are often manually adjustable, as in the case of most volume controls. Then determine if any of the variable parameters are controllable. That's really the key to synthesis, controlling parameters with various functions. We'll be looking into that in the next lesson. Finally, which of these features and parameters are programmable? In other words, can their settings be memorized by the instrument when you make a sound? We will be seeing all of these functions and parameters shortly. A typical synthesizer source is the oscillator. You can think of an oscillator as the basic raw material for sound design. They determine the general pitch range and timbre for most sounds. Most oscillators, sometimes called VCOs or DCOs, have both selectable features and variable parameters. The typical oscillator allows you to select one of two or more wave shapes. This allows you to choose a basic timbre. The most common waveforms are sawtooth, a bright, brassy sounding timbre with all of the harmonic frequencies in its partial structure. Square, a hollow sounding timbre with only the odd harmonic frequencies in its partial structure. You'll be seeing a variation called pulse wave in just a minute. The triangle wave sounds much like the square wave, except it is much duller. It also has only odd harmonic frequencies in its spectrum, but they are of less amplitude than those of a square wave. The sine wave is sometimes available as a selectable waveform. It has a flat, pure timbre. Its spectrum only contains the fundamental. The essential variable parameter on an oscillator is tuning. This allows you to adjust the frequency of the oscillator over a wide range of musical pitches. On most instruments, it is possible to tune the oscillator anywhere from the lower to upper thresholds of pitch perception. So remember, the oscillator is the source of pitch and basic timbre. Let's leave the animation now and explore synthesizer sources. Let's check out the source section of this instrument. It has two oscillators and a noise generator per voice. Let's start with the oscillators. Each oscillator is essentially the same. If we look at the selectable features, we find that there are three waveforms available. Sawtooth, pulse wave, and triangle. The pulse waveform has variable pulse width that can change the square wave to a narrow pulse. This changes the timbre from hollow, only odd harmonic partials, to bright and buzzy, all the harmonic partials. Another selectable feature is sync. The sync function is explained in detail in your manual, but here are some things to keep in mind about it. Sync forces an oscillator to be in perfect tune with the master oscillator, which in this case is oscillator 1. Changing the tuning of an oscillator doesn't affect pitch. Instead, it emphasizes different harmonic frequencies, producing a timbre change. We'll see some interesting uses of sync in upcoming lessons. Along with these selectable features, the oscillator has two variable parameters as well. Tuning, which is in semitones, and pulse width, which we've seen before. Another source on this instrument is the noise generator. It has no variable parameters and only one selectable feature, on and off. Let's look at some modifiers. Most instruments have at least two, one for changing loudness and another for changing timbre. The bell of this clarinet and this volume pedal are loudness modifiers. Synthesizers use a modifier called amplifiers. Let's look at the typical amplifier section on a synthesizer. The variable parameter of an amplifier is, of course, loudness, sometimes called output level, gain, or volume. Amplifiers modify the source's waveform by altering its amplitude. Usually, an amplifier can only make the source amplitude less than the original value. This kind of change in level is called attenuation, which simply means to make less. The key thing to keep in mind about amplifiers is that they modify only one of the big three, loudness. The amplifier is the simplest modifier. It usually has no selectable features and one variable parameter. Possibly the most important modifiers on any musical instrument are those that affect timbre. A fuzz tone, or the body of a violin, can be thought of as timbre modifiers. Timbre modifiers alter a source's spectrum. On synthesizers, the basic timbre modifiers are filters. Let's look at some typical filters. Since filters are timbre modifiers, we'll use a spectrum plot to find out how filters alter the source's waveform. Filters can selectively attenuate specific frequencies. They have a variable parameter called the cutoff point, sometimes labeled frequency. This parameter can be tuned to anywhere within the limits of pitch perception. Partials on one side of this point will pass through the filter unmodified, while partials on the other side will be attenuated. The type of filter, called mode, will determine on which side of the point partials will be attenuated. In this graph, we have used a purple shadow to represent attenuation. You are looking at a spectrum in which all of the partials are attenuated. This would mean that right now, no partials are passing through the filter, and we would hear no sound. As the cutoff point is raised, the attenuation is selectively removed from the spectrum, starting at the fundamental. This allows us to hear more and more of the waveform's partial structure. The sound will change timbre from very dull to very bright. Filters are really just sophisticated tone controls, like those you might find on a stereo or guitar amp. The type of filter shown here is called a low-pass filter, because it allows partials whose frequencies are below the cutoff point to pass unmodified. The attenuation begins at the cutoff point and increases as you go above it. This attenuation slope is called roll-off. Look in your manual for more details about filters. Here are the essential facts. Filters are responsible for changing the basic timbre of a source. This makes them extremely important to sound design, because timbre is the most distinctive parameter of the big three. We will learn in upcoming lessons that control of the filter's cutoff point is the heart of almost all sound creation on analog synthesizers. Remember, filters can modify timbre only by removing partials from a source. For this reason, using filters to create sounds is often called subtractive synthesis. The filter is the most important modifier on a synthesizer. Generally, there are two variable parameters associated with a filter: cutoff and resonance. Cutoff determines the basic timbre of a source. On a low-pass filter, lowering the cutoff removes partials from a source's spectrum. This makes the original timbre change from bright to dark. Changing the cutoff point like this is called sweeping the filter. The resonance control emphasizes frequencies near the cutoff point, making them louder. Sweeping the filter with the resonance turned up allows us to focus in on individual partials of a wave's spectrum. Can you hear the difference between a sawtooth partial structure and that of a square wave? Although the low-pass filter is the most useful mode, there are other kinds of filters. They all have the same variable parameters: cutoff and resonance. Let's compare 4 different filter modes. The low-pass filter mode removes partials above the cutoff point. The high-pass mode removes partials below the cutoff point. Bandpass filter removes partials to either side of the cutoff point. And notch filters remove frequencies at the cutoff point. This concludes the second lesson. Keep in mind that all synthesizers are basically the same. They must all have sources, modifiers, and controllers. And while features and price may vary from instrument to instrument, they generally work in the same way. One is not necessarily better than another. The difference between various synthesizers can be thought of as being similar to the difference between guitars. Some people prefer Strats, some prefer Les Pauls, and others prefer Kramers. They all have different features, but basically they are all played in the same way. In Lesson 1, we learned about the big three. In Lesson 2, we learned about the functions where these parameters of sound reside on most analog synthesizers. We learned that all of the basic synthesizer sources and modifiers have variable parameters. In this lesson, we will learn how to change the variable parameters of these functions over time. The key to sound creation is having specific yet flexible control over each of these variable parameters. Let's review the synthesizer functions we've already examined to see what exactly can be controlled. An oscillator's frequency can be controlled, making a sound's pitch higher or lower. Many oscillators have controllable pulse width for the square wave. The pulse width can be made narrower or wider, causing a change in timbre from a hollow tone color to a bright, reedy sound. A filter's cutoff point can be controlled, modifying a sound's timbre. It can be raised or lowered. This means that partials can be removed or restored to a wave spectrum. In the case of a low-pass filter, raising the cutoff makes a sound brighter, and lowering it makes a sound duller. An amplifier's output level can be controlled, modifying the loudness of a sound. It can be raised or lowered, making the sound louder or softer. It is important to remember that these are the only parameters that can be controlled in the typical synthesizer: oscillator frequency and pulse width, filter cutoff, and amplifier output level. This means that there are usually no more than 4 types of changes occurring at any one time, no matter how sophisticated a sound is coming from the synthesizer. Controllers are synthesizer functions whose outputs are used to change a variable parameter of another function. It is important to understand that you don't hear controllers directly. You hear their effect on sources and modifiers. Theoretically, any controller can be used to change any variable parameter. But on most synthesizers, each controller is only connected to those functions with which it is most musically useful. You should become familiar with the section in the manual on block diagramming, which is a simple graphic way of showing how different synthesizer functions are interconnected. When a controller is connected to a variable parameter, it acts as a robot hand, automatically changing the value of that parameter from its initial setting. The change follows the shape of the controller's output over time. This type of remote control is often referred to as modulation, or simply mod. Usually there is a slider or knob between the controller and the function it is changing that is used to regulate the total amount of change that occurs. These sliders or knobs are often labeled depth or amount. Controllers can alter any of the big three. Therefore, there are many different kinds of controllers. The keys of a flute, the beater of a drum, these are used to control articulation. Synthesizers use piano and organ keys to control articulation. Another common synthesizer controller is the envelope generator. When used to control loudness, it can be similar to a violin bow. Perhaps the single most important controller on a synthesizer is the envelope generator, sometimes called contour generator or ADSR. We will find that it is the key to imitating many different kinds of sounds and effects. It is the envelope generator that allows us to imitate the attack of a brass instrument. Or the crescendo of a string section. Or the percussive snap of an electric bass. The most common type of envelope generator is the ADSR, which are the initials of its 4 variable parameters: attack, decay, sustain, and release. All envelope generators work in the same manner. Their output level will change or cycle between 2 or more levels. An ADSR's output will change between 3: starting level, peak level, and sustain level. The order of the changes is always the same: start first, peak second, sustain third, and then back to start. When an ADSR's output is used to control some parameter, say oscillator frequency, then that parameter will change between 3 levels, and we will hear a change from a starting pitch to a peak pitch to a sustained pitch and back to the starting pitch. The starting level is fixed. The change will begin wherever the parameter to be controlled happens to be set. The next level, peak, is variable and represents the maximum amount of change caused by the envelope. It is set with an envelope amount control. The final level, sustain, is adjustable anywhere from the starting to peak levels. It is set with the sustain control. Right now, you are seeing a graph which shows an ADSR with the sustain level set in between the starting and peak levels. When a key is depressed, the envelope's output will begin to change from level to level. Remember, the order of the change is always the same: start, peak, sustain, start. What makes envelope generators such powerful tools is that the rate of change between each level can be altered from almost instantaneous to very, very slow. The rate of change between the starting and peak levels is called attack. Changing the attack control varies this time from fast to slow. Once the output reaches the peak level, it will immediately begin changing to the sustain level at a rate determined by adjusting the decay control. When the output reaches the sustain level, it will stay there until the key is let up. When the key is let up, the level will return to the starting level at a rate which is determined by the release control's setting. Here's a neat way to check out envelope functions on any synthesizer. First, decide which of the big 3 you wish to change: pitch, timbre, or loudness. Next, set the starting level by manually adjusting the appropriate variable parameter. Then set the peak level with the envelope amount control. Set the sustain level with the sustain control. And finally, adjust your 3 rates: attack, decay, and release. In all of these adjustments, trust your ears to tell you what's right. For instance, let's control pitch. Manually set the pitch to where you want the change to start from. This will be the starting level of the envelope. Next, set the peak level, which is the maximum amount of change that will occur. Since peaks are transient, the envelope never stays at a peak level. We use the sustain as a reference point to set the peak level. This is done by turning the sustain up to maximum and the 3 rates to minimum. Now we can use the envelope modulation control to set the maximum amount, or peak level, of pitch change. Let's make it about an octave. Now you can set the sustain level anywhere between the starting point and the peak. Let's set the sustain for about 1/3 above our starting point. Now that the 3 levels are set, you can adjust the 3 rates. Attack is the rate of change from the starting point to the peak, an octave higher. Decay is the rate of change from the peak down to the sustain level, which is set 1/3 above our starting pitch. decrease is the rate of change from the sustain level back down to the original starting pitch. Here's that same envelope controlling timbre on a low-pass filter. And here's the same envelope controlling the loudness of a VCA. Some things to remember. Once you've set your envelope, adjusting the amount of envelope modulation will alter the maximum amount of change caused by the envelope. The rates will remain constant. There is no time value for sustain. An envelope with sustain will remain on for as long as you hold down a key. Envelopes with no sustain will return to the starting level at a rate determined by the decay setting, regardless of how long you hold down a key. This can be quite useful for percussive effects when controlling a filter or amplifier. Another common synthesizer controller is the LFO. Let's connect an LFO to an oscillator and check out its functions. There are two main variable parameters associated with LFOs. Depth, how much of an effect, in this case pitch change, and rate, how fast this change will repeat. Most LFOs have at least two selectable wave shapes: a sine or triangle, which are good for vibrato effects, and square waves, which are good for trills. Another typical wave shape on an LFO is a sawtooth, sometimes called a ramp. Some synthesizers also have a random waveform available. Remember, controlling an oscillator with an LFO will give you a repeating pitch change, the most common of which are sine or triangle waves used for vibrato. and square waves for trills. Controlling the VCF with an LFO gives you a repeating timbre change. A triangle or sine wave gives a timbre tremolo. Using a sawtooth to control the filter gives a repeating percussive envelope. If you use that in conjunction with some long release times on the amplifier, you can get an echo effect. Many synthesizers have special performance-oriented controllers. Most synthesizers have a global controller called a bender. It can be used, among other things, to simulate stylistic guitar playing. The bender may be in many forms, the most common of which is the pitch wheel. Some synthesizers allow the performer to use keyboard dynamics to control the big three. My left-hand velocity is controlling loudness and timbre. The right-hand pressure is controlling the amount of LFO that goes to the oscillator. In other words, vibrato depth. Another more common way of controlling LFO depth is with a mod wheel. Making a sound is like baking a cake. No matter what kind of cake you're going to make, you know you need milk, flour, and eggs. When you make a sound, you know you need sources, modifiers, and controllers. The kind of sound you're going to make will determine which sources, which modifiers, and which controllers, and how they will be combined. The first thing we'll do is select a source with the appropriate wave shape, like a sawtooth. Then we'll add some timbre modifiers and some loudness modifiers. Next, we'll select an appropriate envelope. or 2 or 3. And sprinkle in a little LFO modulation just for season. If you've got the proper ingredients combined in the proper way, you should be able to make any sound you want. Piece of cake. There are, in fact, specific recipes for every kind of sound. At first, it might seem a little overwhelming when you try to come up with the right settings to make a particular sound on a synthesizer. But as of now, you know just about everything you need to know to make almost any sound. There are 3 secrets to making imitative sounds. 1. Know which basic timbre to use. Often this is a choice between sawtooth and square wave. 2. Know how the timbre changes over time. Usually this involves the filter envelope. Although there seems to be an endless amount of possible settings for an ADSR, believe it or not, there are only 2 basic types of envelopes for most sounds. And 3. Learn to play the synthesizer as if it were the instrument or instruments you are imitating. This is probably the most important and most often overlooked aspect of sound design. Let's take a look at secret number 1. Virtually every musical instrument and almost any other sound-producing mechanism can be placed into one of 4 basic categories relating to the overall spectrum produced by its acoustic source of sound. Spectrums containing all harmonic partials are produced by instruments that use air vibrating in open tubes or vibrating strings to produce a sound, such as brass, strings, both bowed and plucked, and most woodwinds. Instruments that use air vibrating in tubes closed at one end have spectrums containing only odd harmonic partials. This includes some woodwinds like clarinets and recorders, and also whistles and organs. Instruments that use suspended wooden or metal bars, tines, stretched skins, or membranes generally produce spectrums that contain partials that are not all from the harmonic series. Some of the instruments in this group are marimba, vibes, electric piano, timpani, and tom-toms. Unpitched percussion instruments like snare drums, rattles, and hand claps have spectrums that contain random partials. That is, they change in an unpredictable manner from moment to moment. Breath sounds and mechanical noises made by an instrument's action also contain random partials. So do the sounds caused by wind, thunder, and rushing water. This is a convenient method for ordering sounds because it coincides neatly with the sources available on virtually all synthesizers. Sawtooth and narrow pulse waves contain all harmonic partials. Square and triangle waves contain only odd harmonic partials. Non-harmonic partials can be obtained by using multiple sine waves, we'll look at that in lesson 5, or ring modulators. Check your manual for details. A noise generator produces a spectrum with random partials. So much for secret 1. Now on to secret 2. You've certainly heard enough sawtooth waves by now to know that all by itself it sounds very little like a brass instrument, or a flute or violin for that matter. This is because, although those instruments share a basic timbre with a sawtooth wave, their spectrums change in a very specific manner over the course of a note. With these sounds, and most others, it is possible to simulate the spectrum change by controlling a filter's cutoff with an envelope generator. Remember I told you that there are only 2 basic kinds of timbre envelopes? This is because there are only 2 basic kinds of tone production used in most instruments. All instruments that use breath or bowing to produce a sound, like brass or strings, require continuous excitation. If the breath or bowing is stopped, the sound stops. The sound will continue as long as the breath or bowing continues. Continuous excitation instruments will have some degree of a slow attack and sustain. All instruments that are plucked or struck, like a guitar or bell, require only momentary excitation. Striking such an instrument for just an instant will produce a tone that will continue for some time, but it constantly fades away. Momentary excitation instruments will have an instantaneous attack and no sustain. For instance, A trumpet is a continuous excitation instrument. The player must continually blow into it to produce a tone. This animation will show us how the spectrum changes in this type of instrument. When a note begins, the column of air in the trumpet begins vibrating at the fundamental frequency. As the air within the horn continues to vibrate, the additional partials in the timbre are layered over the fundamental until all of the partials in the spectrum are present. This is, of course, the attack portion of the timbre envelope. The rate of the attack is dependent upon the player's phrasing. Generally, wind players overblow the attack. If the note is held for any length of time, the sustained portion is usually less bright than the peak reached during the attack. The decay from peak to sustain is again up to the player's discretion. When the player stops blowing into the horn, the partials fade out in the opposite order that they came in. The rate at which this occurs is again a matter of phrasing, but even if a player chokes off a note, it still takes a certain amount of time for the air in the horn to stop vibrating. This kind of timbre change is a snap to create with an ADSR and a low-pass filter. Once the envelope is set, simply changing the source's wave shape can change the sound from a brass-like timbre to a clarinet-like one, and we'll do that in just a moment. In the case of plucked or struck instruments, like a guitar, all of the partials in the spectrum are generally present at the instant of the attack. The player cannot control the rate of the attack. He can control how bright the attack is by how hard a note is plucked. As the note rings, the partials in its spectrum fade out, from the highest to the lowest. The player can sometimes control the rate of this release by muting the strings, and although the note will stop quite quickly, it will still take a certain amount of time to stop. Again, this is a snap to simulate with an ADSR and a low-pass filter. As for secret number 3, always try to play melodies with characteristic phrasings, articulations, and dynamics of the instrument you wish to imitate. Try to imitate the style of the player as much as the sound of the instrument itself. In Volume 2 of this series, Lessons 8 and 10 will give you many valuable insights into this secret. Okay, let's apply these tools and make some sounds. To make a brass sound, first select the wave shape that's closest to a brass spectrum. The sawtooth wave has the proper partial structure. Next, set the initial timbre by manually lowering the filter cutoff point to where you can just barely hear the fundamental. Set up the envelope by adjusting the sustain to maximum and the rates to minimum. Use the envelope amount to the filter control to set the peak level. This is the brightest our timbre will get. Now you can set the timbre of a held tone by dropping the sustain level to where you want it. Adjust the attack and decay rates to suit the rhythms of your playing. Add a little release, and there's your basic brass sound. Most wind instruments share the same basic envelope shapes. They differ mostly in their basic timbre and overall brightness. The brass sound can become a clarinet type of sound by simply changing the sawtooth wave to a square wave. change the brass sound into a flute-like sound by lowering the amount of envelope control to the filter. Then I'll add a slight amount of delayed LFO to both the filter and the amplifier for some tremolo. Adding additional oscillators to this basic brass sound will create an ensemble effect. I'll add 2 additional sawtooth waves, one tuned a little sharp and the other tuned a little flat. This multiple oscillator technique can be very useful in creating string sounds as well. For string sounds, either a sawtooth or narrow pulse wave will give you the proper spectrum. And on the Moog, I have both waveforms available from each oscillator simultaneously. To set the initial timbre, turn down the envelope control on the filter. Then raise the filter cutoff for the initial timbre, which is quite bright in the case of strings. Set the peak brightness level the same way you did with the brass sound, using an envelope with maximum sustain and minimum rates. In the case of strings, we need only a slight timbre change to simulate bowing. For the string sound, we're going to use a different envelope on the filter than on the amplifier. For the filter envelope, the attack and decay should be relatively slow. The timbre change here is relatively subtle as well. The amplifier attack should be just a little bit slower than the filter attack. That helps to simulate the bowing sound. For string sounds, it's helpful to have release on both envelopes as well. The filter release should be just a little bit longer than the amplifier release. In order to strengthen the illusion of multiple players, we'll add a little LFO sine wave modulation to the pulse width of 2 oscillators. It's time for a change of pace. We're going to start off this lesson with a quick tour of several different synthesizers from some of the world's leading manufacturers. All of these instruments are made up of sources, modifiers, and controllers, and in general they all work the same way. However, every instrument has certain unique features, and although it would be impossible to demonstrate every feature of every synthesizer, we thought you might like to see some of the highlights. You'll notice that each example is labeled. If you refer to the same label in this section of your manual, you'll find more specific information about the instrument and the functions being demonstrated. After our little survey, we'll show you some techniques for editing sounds on these programmable instruments. Most synthesizers come pre-programmed with a wide variety of presets, but they are also user-programmable as well. This means that you can tailor any preset to suit your own musical taste. This is called editing. You know enough about synthesizers and sound to now effectively edit presets. Remember the brass sound we made back in Lesson 3? Let's edit it. Let's make this brass sound more interesting by adding some growl to it. A growl is simply a very fast vibrato. The trick to using this for a brass growl is to remove the modulation so that it's only there for the attack of a sound. The OB8's page 2 functions allow you to use an envelope generator to do this automatically. Now we have just a slight growl on the attack of a note. Here's our original sound, and here's the one we just made. Now let's edit this brass sound into something completely different. Let's turn it into a rock and roll guitar. For this one, let's get timbre modulation from something other than the filter. First, we'll turn off all the envelope control to the filter. We'll set the basic timbre by opening the filter's cutoff point. For our timbre change, we're going to use sync. First, control the tuning of oscillator 2 with an envelope, in this case, the filter envelope. Next, turn on the sync. Now let's set a slow attack and maximum sustain on the timbre envelope, which is the filter envelope now. Let's compare this with our original sound. So far, we've been looking at analog synthesizers. In this lesson, we'll see a different type of synthesis, one based on the principle of frequency modulation, or FM. By now, you should be aware of the significance of timbre as it relates to musical sound. You know that the two basic timbral considerations of the sound designer are overall spectrum and the timbre envelope. FM synthesis provides many new sources of basic wave shape and some very eloquent timbre envelope possibilities. Yet, as we will see, an FM instrument like the DX7 can be approached in much the same manner as any other synthesizer. The DX7 has one basic function called an operator. The instrument contains 16 of these identical functions, and they can be arranged in several different ways to produce and control sound. Before we explore FM, we have to become acquainted with this general-purpose module. What exactly is an operator? It's a function that has controllable frequency and controllable amplitude. There are only two things you can do to an operator: change its frequency or change its amplitude. Let's look at frequency control first. Operator tuning is accessed from the edit mode, as are all programmable features on the DX7. There are two tuning modes: fixed tuning in hertz, which disconnects the operator from the keyboard. This can be useful for vibrato and other effects we'll look at later. The second mode allows the operator's tuning to be controlled from the keyboard. This is the ratio mode. The operator can be tuned to any of the first 31 pitch intervals in the harmonic series. There is a fine tuning control which allows the operator to be tuned to pitches in between the harmonic intervals. Ratio tuning is essential for FM synthesis. For now, we'll leave the tuning at 1. This is the equivalent to a standard A440 tuning. Each operator's output level is controlled by its own envelope generator. The digital envelope generator in the DX7 is more sophisticated than the typical ADSR. It cycles between 4 independently variable levels, labeled simply level 1 through 4. Level 3 is the same as sustain on an ADSR. The envelope will hold at level 3 as long as the key is down. Unlike an ADSR, each of these levels can be set anywhere from minimum to maximum. By the way, for visual clarity, in this animation we're showing you a separate slider for each level and rate, but the DX7 uses only one slider. It is assignable to any of the instrument's variable parameters. There are, of course, 4 independently variable rates as well, labeled R1 to R4. They control the time it takes the envelope to change from level to level. It is possible to create many unusual but useful control shapes with these envelopes. Let's take a look at a few. The envelopes are accessed through the envelope generator section. This envelope will produce a double attack. You can simulate an ADSR envelope on the DX7 quite easily. Set level 1 and 2 to 99, which is the maximum level. Level 4 to 0, and level 3 becomes sustain. Rate 1 is now the equivalent to attack time. rate 3 decay time, and rate 4 is release time. The DX7's envelope generators can be used to create extremely long attack times, up to about 30 seconds or so. You have to hold the key down a long time before you begin to hear anything. Here's a trick for creating a slow attack that can be played rhythmically. Set level 1 for about 70. And set rate 1 for 99, which is the fastest attack. This sets the starting point of the loudness change, and you will hear a soft sound as soon as you hit a key. Now set rate 2 for the attack rate that you want. This allows you to articulate faster rhythms and still have a slow attack on the sound. Another neat trick is programming the envelope generator for a delayed attack. This is done by setting level 1 and level 2 to 0. Set rate 1 to 99. Now rate 3 becomes the attack time. And rate 2 a variable delay time. The DX7 has 16 voices. Each voice uses 6 operators. They can be arranged in one of 32 different configurations called algorithms. Operators on the bottom of each algorithm are sources, and they will be heard. They're referred to as carriers in FM terminology. The operators above them are called modulators. They are controllers, and we will be looking at them shortly. We know enough about the DX7 now to make some sounds. For now, we'll only be using carriers, operators that are sources. Remember, each operator produces a sine wave with controllable frequency and amplitude only. For now, we'll only use the harmonic ratio tuning mode. For our first sound, let's make a drawbar organ, a B3 with percussion. The first 2 operators are tuned to 1. To simulate a 16-foot drawbar. The second 2 operators are tuned to 2 to give you the 8-foot stop. The next operator is tuned to 3 for a 5 1/3 foot stop. The final operator is tuned to 6 for that Hammond quint percussion, and this is accomplished by giving it a percussive envelope. I can control this operator's envelope level with the mod wheel, bringing the percussion in and out. Now let's make a sound that uses non-harmonic tuning ratios. Mallet percussion instruments have partials that are not within the harmonic series. Let's use 3 operators to simulate the first 3 partials of a vibraphone sound. The first operator is tuned to 1, the fundamental, and it has a percussive envelope with some release. The next operator is tuned to 2.7. Its level is less than operator 1, and its envelope is more percussive. The third operator is tuned to the next partial, 6.7 times the fundamental frequency. Its envelope is very percussive and its level is very soft. When these three operators are combined, we hear what sounds like a mallet striking a metal bar. So far, we've been using operators only as sources of sine waves. We've made some different sounds by combining sine waves of various frequencies and amplitudes together to create different timbres. This is called additive synthesis. The DX7 can produce dramatic timbres by another method of synthesis called FM, which stands for frequency modulation. Although FM may seem a little complex at first, it's based on principles that we've already learned about in lessons 2 and 3. The basic FM function is a group of two operators. One is an audio source and is called the carrier. This is the operator we actually hear. The other, called the modulator, is technically a controller. We don't hear it directly, but it is used to affect the wave shape of the carrier, producing a timbre change. Be sure to read the sections on FM timbre production and sidebands in your manual if you want to know all the details. The key thing to keep in mind is that FM is a way of producing spectrum and timbre changes that can be very different than those produced with filters and geometric wave shapes. This gives the sound designer a new palette of tone colors to work with. FM is useful musically because, as we'll soon see, a wide variety of basic partial structures are easy to produce using ratios. We'll also see that the manner in which individual partials are added or subtracted to a wave spectrum can be controlled with an envelope, giving us, among other things, the ability to simulate continuous and momentary tone production, which we learned about in Lesson 3. Let's see how FM works. If the modulator's frequency is low, less than 20 hertz or so, then we will hear vibrato. If we raise the modulator's frequency into the audio range, we cease hearing vibrato and instead we hear a timbre change. The timbre changes from key to key because the carrier is changing frequency and the modulator is not, since it's in the fixed mode right now. This gives us a different interval between each key. In order to get a constant timbre, we need to have a constant interval between the modulator and the carrier. This is done by putting them both in the ratio tuning mode. Doing this gives us a new timbre that is consistent throughout the keyboard range. This is the basic principle behind FM synthesis. Remember when I told you there were only two things you could do to an operator? Control its frequency or control its amplitude? Well, let's see how they relate to making FM sounds. It is possible to make a general comparison between analog and FM functions. We're not saying that both types of instruments are the same, but since a synthesizer must give a musician access to the big three, they must have certain things in common. In general terms, changing the carrier's ratio tuning is similar to changing filter resonance, and changing the carrier's level is similar to changing amplifier level. Changing the modulator's ratio tuning allows you to change basic wave shapes, like selecting waveforms on an analog synth. FM will provide many more basic timbres than the three common analog shapes, sawtooth, pulse, and triangle. Changing the modulator's level will change the number of partials present in an FM wave shape. This is similar to adjusting the filter cutoff on an analog synthesizer. Controlling a carrier's amplitude will affect the sound's loudness in a manner similar to controlling amplitude on a conventional synthesizer. controlling a carrier's frequency by harmonic intervals will produce a relatively subtle timbre change. This is similar to turning up a resonance on an analog synth. Controlling the modulator's frequency by harmonic intervals will change the overall partial structure of the FM waveform's spectrum. This would be like selecting different wave shapes on a conventional synthesizer. Controlling the modulator's amplitude will change the number of partials present in the FM wave shape. The greater the amplitude, the more partials will be present, and therefore the brighter the sound. This can be thought of as similar to controlling filter cutoff on an analog synthesizer. The pitch interval between the carrier and modulator is expressed as a ratio. A ratio is simply a fraction. Don't be intimidated by the numbers. After all, musicians deal with ratios all the time. Time signatures like 12/8 or 4/4 are ratios, and so are half notes and quarter notes for that matter. Ratios are the key to making FM timbres. Here are some simple rules for using them effectively. If the modulator is 1, 2, 3, or 4, the FM timbre will always have the fundamental present, even if the carrier is tuned to some other partial in the harmonic series. Let's listen to some different ratios. This allows you to bring in and out very specific harmonics, like, for instance, the feedback note of an electric guitar with a ratio of 2:1. The modulator number also determines the basic partial structure of an FM sound. It's easy to create timbres very similar in sound to the basic analog wave shapes. If the modulator is 1, the resulting wave will contain partials at all of the harmonic frequencies. This is similar in sound to a sawtooth wave. If the modulator is 2, then the resulting timbre will have all of the odd harmonic frequencies. This is similar to a square wave. If the modulator is 3, then every third harmonic is missing from the spectrum, and it's similar in sound to a narrow pulse wave. Whenever the modulator is an even number, the resulting timbre will have some combination of only odd harmonic frequencies, producing a hollow sound. Here's 1 to 4. If the modulator is set to a whole number of 5 or higher, a wide variety of timbres can be generated. As long as both carrier and modulator are both whole numbers, the FM wave will have some combination of harmonics in its spectrum. The fundamental may or may not be present, and this can create some very strange timbres indeed. If the modulator tuning is not a whole number, in other words, if it has numbers to the right of the decimal place, then there will be partials in its spectrum that are not in the harmonic series. This is a useful technique for making metallic timbres. Let's take a look at a simple FM sound and see how it works. This brass-like sound uses only two operators. One is the carrier, one is the modulator. The carrier's output level determines the overall loudness of the sound. The modulator's output level determines brightness, or how many partials are in the sound. The envelope of the modulator determines the sound's timbre change over time. The tuning ratio between the carrier and the modulator determines the wave's basic partial structure. Changing the modulator's tuning will change the wave shape. For the brass sound, the modulator's tuning is set to 1. And you'll notice that while this shape looks quite different on the scope, that it sounds much like a sawtooth wave, and this is because it has the same basic partial structure. Changing the modulator's tuning to 2 will give us a different wave shape, one with only odd harmonic partials in its spectrum. This is similar to changing a sawtooth wave to a square wave. Changing the carrier's tuning will emphasize different partials in the wave shape. This is similar to turning up a resonance on a conventional synthesizer. The 6 operators in the DX7 can be combined in 32 different ways called algorithms. There are 2 basic types of algorithms, simple ones and complex. A simple algorithm has 1 modulator per carrier. Complex algorithms have more than 1 modulator per carrier. The type of FM source we've been using so far is a simple algorithm. 1 carrier, 1 modulator. It is possible to have up to 3 such sources available at a time on the DX7. This gives you 3 independent sources of pitch, timbre, and loudness. In this sound, several simple FM sources are combined to make a composite sound. This is another simple algorithm sound. 2 operators are used for the bass sound. The keyboard level scaling feature on the DX7 allows me to taper the volume of this sound as I go up the keyboard, making it softer. For the organ, 2 operators with a ratio of 1 to 2 are used to produce a hollow timbre. An additional operator gives us the percussion sound. On the organ sound, the keyboard level scaling lowers the loudness of the sound on the left half of the keyboard, giving us a split keyboard. It is possible to use more than one modulator per carrier on the DX7. Stacking modulators will produce very complex non-harmonic structures. Using modulators in parallel gives you more than one timbre envelope per carrier. By using different ratio tunings on each modulator, it is possible to generate several independent sets of harmonic and non-harmonic partials for one carrier. Both stacked and parallel algorithms are used in this sound to create the complex partial structure of a sitar. Each parallel modulator produces different harmonics. The stacked modulator in the other FM source is providing the complex non-harmonic partials. Pressure and velocity are used to make the sound more expressive. The DX7 has no facility for bending with aftertouch, but it can be done nonetheless. The aftertouch is used to control vibrato depth. If you set the LFO wave shape to a square wave and the rate to 0, then you can do bending with pressure. This concludes Volume 1. Remember, this is a video instruction course. If you need more information about the material presented, all you have to do is rewind. Your manual contains cross-references for each topic and subtopic and their location on the tape. Volume 2 is a continuation of this series, and it contains, among other things, lessons on programming sequencers and drum machines, how to use MIDI, and many synthesizer, performance, and studio techniques.